Hi everyone, welcome back. This week we're going to be looking at Margaret Cavendish. This video is just going to be an introduction to some of the central ideas from her philosophy. In this video, we'll start by giving a little bit of background on Cavendish and her life, and then we'll talk about some of the central philosophical ideas and commitments that sort of guided her thinking about the world. Her naturalism in science and philosophy, her materialism, her idea that matter is actually thinking or intelligent, and ideas about sort of causation and sort of motion sort of being internal to the thing itself, to matter itself. So let's start with just a little bit of background on Cavendish herself. So she was born in 1623. She had no formal education, but she had numerous connections to academic and intellectual life. So she often complained about not having a particularly great sort of education, but she was incredibly well read. She married William Cavendish while she was in exile in France, while she was the lady or maid to Queen Henrietta Maria. Now, this is important because her husband was well connected, and that helped her publish some of her later philosophical works. So she was an incredibly great sort of writer and was able to publish some things on her own. But during this time, obviously, sort of sexism had a sort of rampant sort of effect on the ability of women to contribute to intellectual life in the world during this time. And much of the reason that Cavendish was able to do so was because she sort of had a very sort of privileged life that gave her these kind of connections. And that's why we are privileged with her work today. Now, her husband was able to also arrange various meetings that many women of her time would not have been able to. Between Margaret Cavendish, she was able to interact with people like Hobbes and Descartes, Mersenne and Gassendi. She didn't have any formal correspondence with any of these figures, but she was able to interact with them such that her ideas were being received by them, and she was sort of aware of all of the ideas that were popular at this time, so that she could sort of make her own way and relate her views to many of these other thinkers at that time. And now, just like many of the philosophers that we're reading during the modern period, they were living during this scientific revolution where much of the scientific theorizing was moving towards a mechanistic view of the world, of being able to explain how the world works in terms of sort of pushes and pulls is the idea here. But her own philosophical thinking was largely in opposition to that mechanistic worldview about the way that the material world operated. And so the philosophical letters we read, this is the very last sort of letter in that sort of selection, but I think it's a very good summary of her positions. She says, "I could not choose but repeat the ground of my own opinions in this present." So this is her sort of summarizing her main commitments. First, I am for self-moving matter, which I call the sensitive and rational matter, and the perceptive and architectonical part of nature, which is the life and knowledge of nature. So matter for Cavendish is alive, intelligent, and is capable of moving itself. And everything is built up out of this natural stuff. And knowledge and life is composed of this self-moving matter. Now, I'm of the opinion that all perception is made by corporeal figuring self-motions, and that the perceptions of foreign objects is made by patterning them out. As, for example, the sensitive perception of foreign objects is by making or taking copies from these objects. So as the sensitive corporeal motions in the eyes copy out the objects of sight. All right, so there's a kind of like isomorphism between the motions in the eyes and the motion of the object that it sees. And this is largely a result of the way she thinks about causation and about the motion of objects. All right, similarly, she says, and the sensitive corporeal motions in the ears copy out the objects of sound. The sensitive corporeal motions in the tongue and mouth copy the objects of taste. And the sensitive corporeal motions in the flesh and skin of the body copy out the foreign objects of touch. For when you stand by the fire, it's not the fire or the heat of the fire that enters your flesh. So no heats or transfers to your body. That the sensitive motions copy out the objects of fire and heat. So there's a kind of, like, it's almost like my skin is a copy machine and copies that sort of motions of these sort of fire there. As for my book of philosophy, I must tell you that it treats more of the production and architecture of creatures than of their perceptions. and more of the causes than the effects, more in a general than peculiar way, which are thought necessary to inform you of, and so I remain. So much of her philosophical opinion is in trying to understand the nature of the natural world. So in that quotation, you see a hint of this naturalism that Cavendish is committed to. Committed to this picture where the only things that we can intelligibly think about and gain knowledge of are natural things, so aspects of the natural world around us. So as such, science and philosophy ought to be focusing their time and efforts on studying and understanding the natural world and our place in it. So on her view, we can't have any idea of anything immaterial. So when we talk of God, for instance, she thinks that we don't have any idea what we're talking about. We're just naming something that's incomprehensible to us. Now, her ideas on that are a little bit tricky and interpretation gets controversial, but she does say things of this sort at numerous times. Also, no, Cavendish here isn't committed to the view that the things of the natural world are the only things that exist. She's merely committed to the view that our knowledge and understanding are limited to those things in the natural world. All right. Now, related to this, though, that means that human beings, at least insofar as we understand them, are just as much parts of the natural world as anything else. We're just as much a part of nature as any other animal. We aren't anything special or different than animals. We're just slightly more sophisticated versions of those same kinds of things. So she's thoroughly committed to understand human beings as just another part of nature. All right, so Cavendish is also committed to the view that everything that exists and that we know of and understand is entirely material. It's made up of matter. So the natural world is composed of matter on her view. So the human mind the sort of natural mind that we have is thereby understood to be entirely material, composed of matter on Cavendish's view. So on Cavendish's view, everything is material. Everything's composed of matter, including the human mind. Whereas for Leibniz, we saw everything is monads. So monads here are simple minds. So minds are at the foundation rather than matter. And physical objects and matter are constructed out of the perceptions of these monads. Descartes, Jacob, and Haywatt had this kind of sort of middle ground that said that both aspects of reality are parts of nature. The world is composed of two separate substances, immaterial mind and material matter. So we have this sort of threefold distinction for trying to understand the world around us. Everything is material, including the mind. Everything is mind, including matter. Or some things are mind, some things are matter. Right. Now, many philosophers at the time would have found this idea that human beings and our mind are purely material things to be sort of denigrating and almost sort of offensive to human beings. So remember Jacob and Haywatt's view that value or moral significance and equality of human beings was found in the fact that we all have a rational, immaterial soul. And our bodies at this time were often seen as sort of inactive and as a kind of corrupting part of our nature. So our bodies are just sort of pushed and pulled. They're sort of dead and inert. So it's our immaterial soul that sort of gives life to our body. When we die, when our sort of soul leaves our body, that is, our matter then just sort of sits around, sort of dead, inert, without sort of moving. It's just sort of moved around by other things. And so if we were just matter, the idea is our actions, the things we do, we would just be like rocks going down this sort of stream, inactive, just sort of pushed around by the forces around us. And it was often thought that we ought to turn our attention away from the sensible and physical things towards more worthy objects of our attention. So mathematics, philosophy, these eternal truths that are sort of beyond the physical world, that's where the true things of value, if one were to focus on the body and physical pleasures, that was seen as a kind of temptation that ought to be resisted. So much so that some medieval thinkers had thought sin was literally just one giving in to the sort of temptations of the body. But for Cavendish, this materialism was not seen as sort of denigrating or a devaluation of human beings. It rather was seen as a sort of optimism. So on her view, the implication was not that humans are much worse, but rather that matter, material things, are much more impressive than the way these other thinkers were thinking about matter. She said the conclusion shouldn't be that human beings are just sort of things in the world being pushed around by all these sort of forces that don't sort of act. The conclusion should be that matter, the material that makes us up, is much more interesting and sort of beautiful than the way these other thinkers are thinking about the nature of material things. Moreover, she thought it gave us a more concrete way to study the operations of the mind and even to influence its operations. If everything is material, then the mind is material. And if the mind is material, we can study how the mind works by studying how material things, such as maybe the brain, operates. And that means we may then learn how we could interfere with the material world so as to produce changes to our minds for the better. For instance, she was hopeful that we could learn how the body or brain works so as to produce mental things like depression and mental illness, and thereby discover how to treat these by material means, by influencing the material world. Now, she didn't actually think that mind and thought and perceptions were just in the brain. She thought it was actually throughout the whole body, because she thought matter in general was intelligent. And so, because everything is material in Cavendish's view, the mind must be material. And so Cavendish saw that this meant she had to reject common concepts of matter as dead, inert, and passive. Cavendish proposed that matter itself was capable of intelligence, thought, perception, and sensation. And these were to be construed as the abilities of matter, and thereby inseparable from the matter itself. So perception, thought, was sort of literally contained in the matter itself. And it's not just the brain. My fingers literally sort of perceive the heat. They feel the heat. That sensation is contained in my fingers. I think this is especially plausible when you think about pain. When you get kicked in the shin, for instance, it almost feels as if the pain is in the shin. It feels as if it has a location. And so, on her view, the matter at your shin actually sensed that sort of feeling in that sort of way. That's where it was sort of located. So intelligence, thought, perception, and sensation, they're not merely caused by the activity of the brain, for instance. So the pain is not just caused by something that, by the shin getting kicked. Rather, the sensation is sort of contained in that activity of the cells that are sort of moving around, the sort of excitation of sort of various nerve endings, for instance, when I get kicked in the shin. So thoughts and perceptions are literally housed in matter. They're identical with the activity of matter. They're not mere effects. However, as I said, mind is not just housed in the brain on her view. Intelligence, thought, perception, and sensation are sort of ubiquitous throughout all matter. So sensation sort of pervades all of the material world, so much so that it's not just my brain that feels the heat, that senses the heat. It's my fingers that sense the heat. So even at the level of individual cells and atoms, matter possesses intelligence, thought, perception, and sensation. So on Cavendish's view, there is much matter or material stuff in the world that is animate or self-moving. So life is literally contained in the material thing. So Cavendish tends to think that there really isn't a distinction to be drawn between matter and its motion. So she rejects this Cartesian view that motion is just a mode or property of the matter. Rather, motion just is a particular kind of matter. The motion belongs to the matter itself. It's part of the matter. And so this leads to Descartes' own view of motion is wrong. She thinks that motion cannot be transferred from one object to another because motion belongs to the object itself. And so as we'll see, she thought that if motion was transferred, matter would be transferred with it. And so if the motion of one object was transferred to another, this object would get bigger because more matter would be adding to it because motion is literally part of the matter. Right, so the motion of an object then needs to be explained in terms of its own self-movement. But Cavendish holds that one body can get another body to move via contact. At this contact, it's as if sort of body A, so when one ball sort of comes in, sort of hits another ball, looks like it moves the other, looks like it transfers that motion. But rather it's that there's this motion on one sort of ball, and when they come into contact, there's a kind of communication almost, where the first, this motion sort of communicates to the other that it wants the other one to move in this sort of way. And this understands that and sort of communicate back and forth so that this one then moves as a result of this sort of request. So in a sense, it's the intelligence and communication of bodies that explains how the first sort of ball prompts or causes the other to move at a later time. The motion is contained in each of these objects, and it doesn't transfer one to the next. Rather, it's the intelligence that sort of allows them to communicate and thereby follow those instructions and do what the other one tells it to do and adjust its own motion in light of that request from the other. And this leads Cavendish to a rather interesting view of the nature of perception that was sort of discussed in the first quote we saw that we'll discuss later. All right, so that's all for this video, just an introduction to some of those basics of Cavendish's thought. I'll see you next time. Bye-bye.